It's the beginning of October, so it's long overdue time to give another update on my back garden pond. I've been living in Galway City for 18 years now, but like lots of other people who came from somewhere else to put down roots here, I'll always be regarded as something of a blow-in, the term of almost endearment that Galwegians use for the likes of me. And just like myself, my new pond has also become a place for blow-ins to put down roots and thrive. The most obvious blow-ins are the wildflowers growing all around the pond. As I mentioned in the last video, most of the flowers landed as seed in the sapling pots last autumn, and I've since transplanted them to the pond border. I've also benefited from living close to the university. They have cultivated some wild meadows on their lawns, and now I'm getting lots of dog daisies, cuckoo flowers, and even willow and ash saplings growing in the garden. Now, the willow has probably come from the edges of the Eglinton Canal, which is just over 400 metres from my back garden. One particular set of blow-ins were the 4 ragwort plants that grew in pairs at either end of the pond. I didn't have any ragwort in the garden last year, so these are clearly the result of seed heads blowing into the garden over last autumn. The ragwort attracted cinnabar moths, whose caterpillars absolutely love ragwort. I didn't actually see the moths themselves visiting, but a bunch of their caterpillars feasted on the ragwort all during the summer. The caterpillars didn't last too long because the weather wasn't great during the summer. However, as the summer progressed into early autumn, tortoiseshell butterflies were very frequent visitors to the ragwort flowers, feeding right up until the time the flower heads went to seed. The flower plants that are planted in and around the pond this year all flowered and were in bloom for all of the summer and early autumn. It's mid-October now, and the nasturtiums are still in flower and have spread around the pond. They'll keep growing and flowering until late autumn or early winter, and will be an important source of food for the last of the bees or other insects that survive into the winter. I was hoping that they'd also attract some caterpillars, but I didn't see any on the leaves when I looked in the last few weeks. The lily blossoms are just about reaching the end of their flowering season, but they did flower continuously all summer, and the lily pads grew well this year as well. They provided shade to keep the water temperature low, and also provided a platform and a habitat for insects. The water hawthorn flower, which is an introduced species and I bought it in a garden centre, flowers continuously through the year, both winter and summer, and the leaves also provide surface cover for the water. Most of the other water flowers have now bloomed and faded, such as the loosestrife at the edge of the pond, which gave a great display during the summer but is now gone to seed. Similarly, the water mint has pretty much faded completely by now. But during the summer, it attracted lots of insects and it was flowering continuously. But it also spread its roots through the soil and mud around the pond as I'd hoped. As the roots spread, they help bind the loose clay at the edge of the pond, and that gives a bit of structure to the pond as time goes by. The water mint is also a great source of food for the bees and other insects. They just couldn't get enough of it during the summer. As regards the flowers around the edge of the pond, the wild mustard flowers are the original blow-ins. They grow in abundance every year in any area of the garden that I dig up, and have the longest flower span of any of the flowers. They first appear in late spring, and there's still a few stragglers flowering and attracting insects even now in mid-October. They also produce prodigious amounts of seed, which of course in turn helps even more flowers appear next year. Another prolific flower is borage. It grows everywhere around the pond and around the garden. It all has descended from a single packet of seed that I planted years ago, and with all the digging and moving of earth, it's now everywhere in the garden. The bees love borage, both the bumblebees and visiting honeybees, and the borage plants produce flowers continuously during the summer and autumn. As I said, there's still a few flowers visible now, and even as the temperature is beginning to drop, there's still a few bees flying around, and their first port of call is always the borage flowers. I'll probably add a few more plants in the coming year. I have scattered some poppy and cornflower seeds around the edge of the pond. I've also planted some 3 lupin seeds in pots that will probably take a couple of years to become shrubs of a meaningful size. Tree lupins are evergreen and they attract huge numbers of insects, which of course in turn provides both cover and food for birds in both winter and summer. I also have a single meadowsweet plant which grew quite large this year, and the flowers were a big attraction for bees and for aphids. Since making the new pond, I haven't seen a lot of birds around it. This is probably due to the fact that I haven't been watching the pond as much as I'd like to, mainly through holidays, and it's been a lot of wet weather this summer. The new pond does have a lot more plants around the edge of it, so there's probably ground birds hopping around that I can't see. A pair of collared doves have been visiting the garden since last year, and they've become particularly fond of the pond. The starlings that fledged from the nest at the side of my house are still hanging around as well. They're locals basically. Other locals include juvenile blue tits and great tits. Their nests were probably in a neighbour's garden, but they feed regularly around the pond. As I mentioned in the last video, the weekend that I dug the new pond, a nest of 4 baby wrens fledged and spent their first week chirping and getting the hang of flying at the back of my garden. One didn't survive the week, but the other 3 were still being looked after and occasionally fed for the following 6 weeks. 3 months later, I'd been wondering if they'd survived, and just last week the 2 parent wrens flew into the garden with 2 of the offspring. The 2 young ones were responding to the parents, who were giving alarm calls to warn them of a cat that was dozing in a nearby garden. During the summer I did have a willow warbler pay a visit. It's a summer migrant to Ireland and a first for my garden. It was attracted to the aphids that had infested the meadowsweet plant in the pond that I mentioned earlier. Despite placing a lot of prime nest building mud around the edges of the pond, I didn't actually get any swallows calling to the pond this year. It might be that they'd already built their nest by the time my new pond was created, but it's more likely that the swallows from last year just didn't survive the migration. Hopefully other swallows will discover the pond next year. One thing I didn't have to worry about this year was evaporation. This summer it rained and it rained and it rained. I certainly wasn't expecting to see the pond full to the brim so early in the season. As I've mentioned before, the gutter on the flat roof of the studio beside the pond is at the wrong angle, so water spills into the garden rather than down the drain. I've never fixed it because some birds use the gutter as a safe drinking source, and it also sends water into the back garden. Now that the pond is there, I'll probably never fix it, and hopefully I'll never have to top up the pond artificially as a result. I had planned to get a bigger water tank to store rainwater this year, but I obviously didn't need one this year, and I might not need one next year either. There are plenty of honeybees visiting the garden, as well as lots of other types of bees as well. In fact, an entire swarm of honeybees showed up one day, filling the air with bees and briefly settling on some bushes next door before disappearing. They didn't go too far. The same number of honeybees were still visiting after the swarming, and mainly focusing on the borage plants. So I've had leaf cutters around this year as well as hoverflies and other flies that like to hover around the water's edge. The bumblebees really like the nasturtiums, presumably because they can crawl right into the flower heads to feed. The garden has attracted lots of butterflies too, some tortoiselles that are attracted to the nettles but also are very fond of the ragwort. I'm also seeing plenty of large white butterflies too. I'd hoped they'd produce plenty of caterpillars that would feed on the nasturtium leaves, but I haven't seen any this year. The more butterflies and moths that arrive into the garden mean there's more caterpillars on the plants, and that means more foods for the smaller birds. That's the plan anyway. There are plenty of insects that I can't identify, like this bee or wasp, and then I get occasional visitor that I do recognise, like this hummingbird hawk moth, which is a summer visitor from mainland Europe. Despite all the flowers around the pond, the hawk moth decided to feed on the flowers of the cleavers, which even I struggle not to describe as a weed. Though apparently cleavers is a favourite food for many moths, so I'll probably have to put up with it in the future. Cleavers was part of my dead hedge, which really came alive this year, mainly with nettles and brambles, probably a bit too enthusiastically. I have cut back the bramble in the dead hedge, since there's more of it elsewhere in the garden. I've also had to trim back some of the nettles. I was just tired of getting stung. But I will leave some for next year for the tortoiseshell butterflies. I've seen very few ladybirds in the garden this year, and I'm not sure why. And I haven't had any grasshoppers or crickets at all. I do, however, have plenty of spiders. The margins of the pond provide both excellent cover and hunting grounds. Hopefully I'll get some time next year to study them in a bit more detail. As regards the creatures that live below the water surface, I haven't really had time to explore or record that insect life in any detail. So my observations so far are from what I can see from just staring into the water from the edge of the pond. Just like the old pond, there are loads of pond skaters living on the surface of the pond. They're aggressive hunters, and they're quick to the scene if anything falls into the water surface or looks like it's weak, and they always seem to be hungry. I've noticed during late summer that a lot of water beetles had appeared in the pond. They spend their time scurrying around the pond and slime in the shallows. One particular beetle climbed onto a lily and seemed a little bit shaky. Straight away, a couple of pond skaters were over like vultures. They were out of luck, however. The beetle swam off, looking fine after a while. I've also had a lot of water boatman insects in the pond. Back in June or July, I noticed what appeared to be a nursery of baby water boatman insects in a very shallow but clear area of water at the edge of the pond. There appeared to be larger insects guarding the nursery. The nursery was essentially lots of very small water boatman insects that were grouped together on the floor of the pond. It'd be interesting to see if I can observe something similar next year. The real triumph this year has been the dragonflies and, to a lesser extent, the damselflies. The pond was continuously active with dragonflies during the entire summer since I dug it. It's probably not surprising that dragonflies found the pond so easily. It's just 400 metres from the Eglinton Canal and just under 600 metres from the River Corrib. But I have been pleasantly surprised at the number of species that showed up this year. The first dragonfly to appear was a male four-spotted chaser, and it appeared just a week after the pond had been filled with water. For a long time, I only saw a single male four-spotted chaser, but not a female. I think the same one stood guard over the pond for a few weeks and then probably gave up once no females arrived. The birch branch that I put up as a perch worked fine. Four-spotted chasers like to use such perches to guard their territory and to use as a launch spot for either passing females or arriving males. However, later in the year I spotted a female chaser laying eggs in the pond, so that male had not strutted its stuff in vain after all. They also serve who stand and wait. Chaser larvae take 2 years to emerge, so I'll have to wait until next year for the patter of little dragonfly wings. Chasers can also get their mating done in as little as between 5 and 20 seconds, so it's not surprising I didn't catch them in the act. The chaser is a pioneer species, so obviously a new pond was an attraction. Another pioneer species is the emperor dragonfly, Ireland's largest dragonfly and also one of the most visually impressive. At least one female emperor dragonfly laid eggs in the pond this year. Female emperors inject their eggs into foliage, and this one took a shine to the lily blossom in the centre of the pond. The presence of emperors might have explained the disappearance of the four-spotted chasers, as emperors will prey on them. Some emperor larvae will emerge in the first year, but I didn't see any. It's more likely that the larvae will mature over the winter and emerge next year. That larvae will feed on tadpoles, water snails and other creatures, so they'll have an impact on the underwater ecosystem in the coming year. I've also had both ruddy darters and common darters visit the pond, and the common darters mated and laid eggs, and were good enough to do so while I was beside the pond holding a camera at the time. I do struggle a little bit to tell the difference between the two, so it may be that I've mixed them up even in this video. Darters tended to use a number of places as perches to sun themselves and view over the pond, including that birch branch. This is the second year that the darters have appeared. They showed up earlier this year than last year in the old pond, when it was September before they showed up. I'm pretty sure that the darters that visited last year laid eggs, which should have emerged this year. However, I didn't notice any emergent darters this summer. I also had hawker dragonflies visit the garden. I've occasionally seen brown hawkers fly over the garden, but I've never seen any land in the garden or near the pond. I did see a female migrant hawker land near the pond at the end of the garden in a clump of ivy. It didn't seem to mind me walking around it for a better look. I didn't see any males in the garden. This footage of a male migrant hawker was taken a few kilometres west of my house, at the edge of the city earlier this year. The male migrant hawker didn't seem too bothered by my presence either. Migrant hawkers are relatively rare in the west of Ireland, so it was cool to see one in the back garden. There were only 4 recorded sightings in Galway this year, and I had 2 of them. I didn't have any diversity at all when it came to damselflies. As far as I can see, I just had blue-tailed damselflies visit and breed the pond. However, I did have a lot of them, and they were visible right throughout the summer. The blue-tailed damselfly is also a pioneer species, so it's not surprising that they found the pond. Some blue-tailed damselfly larvae complete their cycle to adulthood in a single season, but often it's the second year before they emerge. In any case, I didn't see any newborns this year. In fact, most of the dragonfly and damselfly species that visited the pond this year were pioneer or colonizer species. It'll be interesting to see what species turn up next year, or if any of those species return. Also, the larvae of this year's visitors should begin to emerge next year, so we'll just have to wait and see what happens.
In conclusion, it's amazing how much wildlife is attracted to a smallish water-filled hole in a city back garden. I really couldn't have asked for more from the pond in its first year. It's been a source of contentment, comfort and constant learning throughout the whole year. This scene probably summarises perfectly the wonderment of having a back garden pond. A female emperor dragonfly, a beautiful complex creature, and in this domestic setting an apex predator, laying eggs by injecting them directly into the stem of a plant that I'd sown a few months earlier. Nearby, a pond skater lurks, looking for a handy meal. They truly are the scavengers of the pond. And in the background, hundreds of tiny water boatmen baby insects swirling around. Actually, they could be either water boatmen or backswimmers. They're very similar, and I have both in the pond, and they too will act as predators if they survive. This footage was recorded in June. Emperor dragonfly eggs hatch after about 3 weeks, so those larvae are now about 4 months old, roaming the bottom of the pond and eating anything that moves. This is an experience that simply could not have occurred in my street without digging the pond, and I look forward to many more wonderful experiences and learnings in the months to come. Thanks for watching.